likelihood of pain and injury and stuff like that. So really excited to dive into a lot of things. I feel like we're going to get into a lot of different kind of nuanced topics as well. But I kind of want to start high level because I know as a trainer, both of us have heard a lot of people who maybe don't necessarily know a whole lot about training, or maybe even do know some about training. They'll say things like, and you mentioned this in your book a little bit, like deadlifting is bad for your back. Running, it's bad for your knees. Benching, it's bad for your shoulders. Squatting, it's bad for your hips. Now, if you were to just hear some of that like surface level stuff to somebody who is like telling you in person and you didn't have a chance to be like, hey, read my 500-page book, how would you kind of reply to them to make it seem like, or make them realize that that's not exactly.
We hear that stereotype every single day, and we have our clients hearing that from people that are in this God's complex, which are the physicians out there,
Yep.
some physical therapists that don't have a movements approach. And I can't not disagree with them to some extent because there's a reason that the stereotype exists that deadlifting is bad for your back and squatting is bad for your knees and running is going to lay havoc on your entire system because a vast majority of people are entering a fitness solution which they're not necessarily prepared for. So
Mm.
they go in and they deadlift for the first time, but then they try to max out, go too hard, too heavy, too quickly without the form and the requisite technique. And then all of a sudden we kind of turn into, hey, this exercise is bad for XYZ. And I can kind of understand it, but when you peel back the surface layer a little bit, it is absolute BS because the things that are the most quote unquote injurious in the gym are most likely the things that we need to rebuild so they can protect us for the long term. You know,
Mm.
thinking about things like deadlifting, yes, it's going to be the most injurious activity in terms of weight training, but it's also the thing that is the number one movement pattern on earth to protect against all forms of lower back pain and injury. And then you talk about running. Hey, running is the most popular activity on earth, but it can be a huge form of cardiovascular health and fitness moving forward. I think the key is that we need to start moving for our body. We need to have common sense in moving into a fitness solution. And we need to be able to say that our body is different than the person right or left of us. And we need solutions to train specifically for our body and not necessarily worry about anyone else's.
So good. I love that. The couple things I want to reiterate there. I think it's so true that people are entering a fitness solution that they're not really ready for. They're trying to go run when like they might not be able to really balance on one foot or stand on one foot or hop on one foot for very long. They're trying to do a deadlift for, I don't know, 100 pounds when they haven't hit those prerequisite steps necessary in order to be able to do it correctly and in order to have the right strength to be able to do a certain weight. So I think that's so true. And then I think it is pretty ironic that you said some of the exercises that are the most injurious, like meaning most uh, frequently maybe people injure themselves, are also the best for long-term health and bulletproofness, if you will. And so it's important to make sure that you don't just write these things off as they're bad to do, because when done properly and when you set yourself up for success, like they are super important to do. So like, let's start with it. Let's just go deadlift then, since that's probably one of the most popular ones that people completely just denounce. What are some things, if somebody's listening right now and they have maybe deadlifted a little bit or not really deadlifted, what are some of like the prerequisite things that they need to know from a strength perspective and maybe a form perspective before kind of diving into doing something like that?
Well, if you've been hurt deadlifting before, if you haven't deadlifted in a while, or you've totally deactivated the hip hinge pattern, which is the movement pattern that houses the deadlift specific exercise, don't just go right back into the peak of the pyramid, the hardest thing that we can do with the maximal loading. What we need to do is just be able to put back the pieces in terms of learning some new motor skills, being able to practice those skills, being able to callous the system under load, and then train specifically for our body and its unique needs. And that means that we have a step by step approach to be able to rebuild the hip hinge movement pattern. And this is something that is a non negotiable inside of pain free performance is that we're not Superman. We go, hey, you just hurt your lower back back deadlifting, take 6 weeks off, and then just go do exactly the same thing and just hope and pray that you don't hurt yourself again. That is craziness. Instead, we're going to be able to go in and look at maybe the weak link. Where do we need to get stronger? Where do we need to get more skilled? Where do we need to respect the training process or the weights a little bit more? And then we start to go in and refine utilizing our system. That's two different ways. So we have an access point into what's an exercise that you feel confident and competent in today that falls inside of that hip hinge pattern that can train the glutes and the hamstrings and the lower back. And how can we elicit a desired training effect without pain today? There's
Yeah,
so many different awesome options for that. But while we're doing that, it's not good enough just to go, hey, we're not going to go back in and actually try to train and evolve the system that did break down on us. We're going to go back in and we're going to identify mobility issues, stability issues, try to learn new motor skills with corrective exercises or maybe activation drills, and have a more long term strategy of trying to make your system stronger and more resilient so we don't line up with those same lower back irritations or injuries again. And I think that this is a step by step approach that is a little bit more sustainable in terms of finding out how you move, what your ideal movement patterns look like, and then giving time its way to be able to strengthen and to be able to put on muscle and be able to just get better at the movement skill itself.
totally.
Taking away all of the variables of, hey, you need to move uniquely for your body. We just need time to be able to adapt to a stimulus. And adapting to that stimulus is not only, hey, just go in and do the thing lighter. That's the mistake most people make, especially with deadlifting. We need to rebuild the whole thing. And there's many different ways in order to break down that hip hinge to create strong strength and resilience.
Yeah, let's actually just go before moving on. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's important because there's going to be some people who are lifting and they have had back injuries doing deadlifts before, or I've felt pain doing deadlifts before. If you were to go back and give us that sequential approach to kind of relearn the hip hinge, callus the system to gradually more loads and making sure that mobility, maybe those three things, like making sure the mobility is where it needs to be, the movement pattern is trained right, and then you callus the system to bear more load. How would you kind of progressively do that?
Yeah, four-stage approach if you're looking to return to deadlifting stronger and healthier than ever. The first approach is to take a horizontal force vector. What that essentially means is we're going to be doing things like glute bridges, hip thrusts, and band or cable pull throughs. That allows us to have the hip hinge mechanics be honed. We get to work on mobility, stability, isometrics at the lower back, and it is super spine sparing, meaning that there's very low spine stress, very high muscular stress. That is the place to start. The second place to go from that, step two, is to be able to go in and do something called the Romanian deadlift or Romanian deadlift variations. Essentially, we start at the top out of a neutral position, and then we hinge our hips back with a neutral spine, slight knee bend, and we're able to explore that full and complete range of motion, stretching the hamstrings at the bottom, flexing the glutes at the top, again, being able to make sure that our spine and our pelvis stay in a neutral form. Step three would be, okay, now we feel confident to start moving the load from the ground up into a standing position. I like being able to work over center of mass, meaning that we don't go directly to the barbell. We utilize things like a kettlebell between the feet, a trap bar that places our body on the center of mass, and we're able to actually stand that up again with that hip hinge pattern. The big difference between a Romanian deadlift and then a deadlift off the ground is how we breathe, how we brace, and how we prepare our pillar and our stability to be able to withstand the stress with good technique. So that third step is a really big step in order to brace from the bottom. And then finally, if you do find yourself strong and healthy and feeling really good and confident in it, that's when we move back into some sort of barbell deadlift variation, whether that be pulling off of blocks to increase the range or to decrease the range of motion while increasing the bar height off the ground, whether that be changing the stance, going a little bit wider at the feet and narrower at the arms. There's many different ways to go back into the barbell than just one generic deadlift. But that four-stage process is exactly